That's for the stragglers like Severin to arrive.
Yeah.
And then we'll get going.
Okay, let's start. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining. I'll just share my screen. Right, I hope that's visible to everyone.
Yeah.
Great, okay. So welcome. We are having our next Native Species Aquaculture Alliance webinar today, and the focus will be Southeast Asia. So just for those who are new here and who weren't here for our launch webinar a few months ago, just a quick introduction into what we hope to do with the Alliance. Native Species Aquaculture, as many of you know, offers an alternative model for aquaculture development, aiming to balance environmental sustainability, biodiversity, and commercial viability, both for investors and for communities. And despite its strong ecological and economic potential, native species aquaculture remains relatively under-researched and underfunded, especially when we compare it to the global expansion of a small number of widely farmed species. And we see that particularly in Africa and parts of Asia. And this is where the NSAA, our alliance, comes in. We aim to catalyze collaboration, research and investment in native species aquaculture systems, and we hope to build a network of pilot examples that show that NSAA can be scalable across the global south. So our focus today is, like I just mentioned, Southeast Asia, with a particular example on the Philippines. And our speakers today are Jonah van Beijnen and Kyra Hoevenaars. And so I'll just quickly introduce them, and then before I hand over to you guys, welcome. So Jonah is a biologist focused on sustainable fisheries and aquaculture, and especially works on how responsible seafood production can support environmental sustainability and livelihoods. In 2008, he co-founded Fins and Leaves in the Philippines, which is an NGO that developed one of the country's first sustainably operated grouper hatcheries. And then later he went on to found VB Consultancy. And he has worked on aquaculture ESG risk analysis, ASEAN Good Aquaculture Practice Guidelines, national aquaculture standards, and international sustainability seafood initiatives. And Kyra is an aquaculture consultant who has experience setting up and managing projects all across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. And her work includes hatchery systems, grow-out operations, implementing good aquaculture practices, capacity building, and aquaculture assessments and audits. And alongside co-founding Fins and Leaves with Jonah, she works as a freelance consultant through her company Too Big Consultancy, through which she aims to increase the sustainability in the sector. So together they bring a valuable combination of practical hatchery development, farm operations, conservation experience, and also policy engagement. So Jonah will go first and share about the importance of NSA in Southeast Asia, and then Kyra will focus on the Philippines as a case study through their work with Fins and Leaves. So over to you, Jonah. Welcome.
Oh, thank you, Annemarie, for the fantastic introduction and for the invitation. It's an honor to be here today and to speak to so many people interested in native species. So I called my short presentations Thoughts on the Development of Native Species for Aquaculture, Lessons from Southeast Asia. And it's important to explain that it are thoughts. So they are just ideas of mine after working and living in the region for almost 20 years. So as Annemarie explained, I farmed fish in the Philippines, native species, for about 11 years. And then I worked in Thailand, Myanmar, and other countries across Southeast Asia, predominantly focusing on native species. So after that, I moved to Spain, but I developed a lot of ideas on how we could do things and how we could perhaps do things better. So honored to be here today and to talk with you about my thoughts and ideas. So in the Southeast Asian or Asian context, it's important to understand that originally almost all the farming that the people have been doing is of native species. So species like pangasius in Vietnam, it's native, or most carps, the #1 species farmed worldwide, are native in China. So people started out with farming native species. However, in the last 2-3 decades, this really seems to be a strong trend towards farming a handful of dominant species like sea bass, sea bream, salmon, and tilapia. And this is happening often outside their native range, especially in Asia and Southeast Asia. It seems like there's a trend towards farming more of these species. And one problem is that these species, the dominant species, are often carnivorous and top predators. So their farming comes with a higher footprint because they need typically a lot of fish meal in their diet. And the feces of carnivorous fish also tend to contain more nutritious waste, more nitrogen, so it has the potential to pollute the environment more. So in my years in Southeast Asia, I really noticed that many businesses seem to think that these non-native species like tilapia or sea bass and sea bream have more economic potential than their own native species. And I'm here to talk to you today and to share my ideas that I think that's actually on the contrary, that there is a huge untapped potential for the development of these native species in Southeast Asia. Next. I believe, by the way, that we do the questions and discussion on the end. So just remember your questions or write them down in the chat screen. And then after Kyra's presentation, we can go through them. Just as a formality, but it has already been extensively discussed in previous presentations. What is the issue with farming non-native fish? Well, especially if you do it in open culture environments, so in fish ponds where they can escape, or in cages where they can go outside the nets, there are potentially a lot of negative environmental impact. So one is species replacement and possible species extinction. So like that was explained in the previous webinar, when Nile perch were introduced to the Lake Victoria, they replaced the native species and they ate a lot of them because they were voracious predators. Another thing is replacement of the local gene pool, the spread and introduction of new pathogens and diseases, and habitat alterations and possible ecosystem imbalance. I don't want to go through it into too much detail, but I just put it here as a background. So besides loss in biodiversity, which most of us understand and realize as the major impact, there's often also a loss of income from local fishermen, and this is often overlooked because local native species are often more valuable and more potential in the local market. So when they are replaced with invasive non-native species, local fishermen often lose out. But I will talk a little bit more about it when I give 1 or 2 examples later in this presentation. Next. So there's an error in the slide here. So I forgot to take that out. You can move 1 or 2 slides ahead. Yeah. So a few examples of recent issues in Southeast Asia, because there's actually been a lot in the news and even making the headlines. So one is tilapia from Africa have replaced a small native species in the region, and a relatively unknown tilapia called the black chin tilapia. It has been spreading throughout Thailand, and it has been in the news like on a monthly basis because it's been taking over rivers. It has been taking over fish ponds where people are farming other species. But now, just last week, it was in the news that they even found this fish species now in large numbers in the coastal zone, so in fully marine water in coral reefs. So that potentially has really devastating consequences. Another example is the invasive janitor fish. So this is actually a fish that wasn't farmed for food, but it's a pet. It's a bottom-dwelling catfish that people keep in aquariums, but they grow a bit big and then people don't want them anymore and they release them into the local river. So what we've seen in several cities in Southeast Asia, like Manila and Jakarta, that they are catching now thousands and thousands of these janitor fish in local rivers. And one is they are useless for local fishermen because nobody eats them. But they eat local fish species, but they also constantly disturb the bottom of the river. So the water becomes very turbid and unsuitable for local fish species. So they just move out and they are in the end all replaced by janitor fish that nobody knows what to do with. So you see, that's a really big problem, not only from an ecological perspective, but also from an economic perspective for the local fishermen. Mm-hmm. Next. So we are here to talk about the more positive side. So what are actually the advantage of farming native species? So one is, in almost all cases, native species are better adapted to the local environment and to the local climate. So you will tend to have better results when you're farming them versus non-native, non-local species. Native species tend to also be better adapted to local pathogens. So since they have been living with these local strains of diseases for thousands of years, only the weak ones often get infected and don't survive. While if you use non-native species and put them in your fish pond or in your fish cage, they haven't developed this relationship with these diseases, and they often fare much less well, and you have higher mortality rates. Research has also shown that local fish species often have bigger demand and better demand, so they fetch higher prices. Because local fish species, they play an important role in local culture, in local culinary traditions. So what we see, especially as the middle class get richer and tends to show more interest in their traditional culture and in their famous culinary dishes, the demand for native and local species improves, and you can get really a good price, and you don't need to export your produce, which makes things also much simpler for you as a fish farmer. Research has also shown, oh, sorry, Annemarie. Oh, I took a breather there.
It's okay. It's about.
In many cases, smaller local fish species are actually also more nutritious and contain more key nutrients in comparison to the dominant species like tilapia or sea bass or salmon that I mentioned before. So for development aid projects, this is also important in areas where there's food insecurity or where there is after a war or a big storm and the local food security situation needs to be improved again. Farming smaller native species often has a nutritional advantage for the people who eat them compared to the dominant species that I mentioned before that are gaining popularity. So all in all, I would say to make aquaculture more resilient and future-proof, something I think we all agree that is needed with the changing climate and more weather extremes, native species really make sense. This time you can go to the next one. As we are only talking about Southeast Asia, I'm very excited about native species also in Africa and in South America, but I deleted those slides for today because otherwise we don't make it within the hour. But when we just look at Southeast Asia, for example, it hosts over 30% of all global freshwater fish species. About over 2,200 have already been described. And currently, only about 20 or 30 of these are cultured on a commercial scale. So some untapped species that are only cultured on a limited scale or in one country and not in the other yet, or that are not cultured at all, but for which I see a lot of potential in Southeast Asia include mullet, rabbitfish, hilsa, that's a fish that lives in Myanmar, India, and Bangladesh, ludong, which is a mullet type living in the Philippines, and which is the country's most expensive fish actually per kilogram, and which is really favored in expensive restaurants for rather rich people. Sea cucumbers, assorted shells, so bivalves, especially oysters, because to give you an idea, almost all the oysters cultured worldwide are Pacific oysters, which are not native to most regions, but there are a lot of local native oysters that are super interesting and that have a lot of potential. One of my personal favorites, the giant gourami, different carps. I mean, the Mekong is an enormous river. It contains many interesting freshwater species. Mud crab, you know, these big crabs you find in the mangroves with these fat claws. Tiger prawn, many of you know them, but their culture really has been displaced by white leg shrimp in Southeast Asia, which in the end had a lot of devastating consequences because they're less resilient to local diseases, and slowly they are now being replaced again by the native tiger prawns. The giant freshwater prawn, the Macrobrachium you see on the picture on the right, and a wide range of marine aquarium fish. And I will highlight now a few examples because I don't want to take too much of your time. So super interesting fish, not only for Southeast Asia, but also for Africa, for example, is the mullet. So most mullets live in the coastal zone, so in brackies and marine waters. Some also move into rivers and can live in freshwater. They're predominantly herbivorous, meaning that they can eat all sorts of seaweeds, or at least plant-based pellets. That ensures the culture of them comes with a lower footprint and with less waste. And the filter feeder, so you can stimulate the growth of algae and zooplankton in your pond, free food, and grow your mullet. And besides the excellent flesh quality, the eggs are also really of value. Actually, I currently live in Spain, and here it's called botarga, and in Italy as well. And it's like a dried or smoked product, and it's as expensive as caviar from sturgeons, and it's really popular. So you use a bigger percentage of your fish for the consumers, because often eggs and milk are thrown away when processing fish. But with this fish, it's a product you can sell as well. So what a few scientists and people got to say about is, well, fishermen often joke that mullets are the best fish you never caught, because many fishermen don't target them because they're not really aware of the species, but they have really got a lot of potential. As my colleague Dr. Luciano Gomez believes, mullets are the past, present, and future of aquaculture. At the end of the presentation are a few references of articles that me and my colleagues Kyra and Greg Jan have written. One of them is about mullets, and you can read more about them there. Another favorite, the rabbitfish. So across Southeast Asia and actually also in East Africa, especially Kenya, rabbitfish are quite popular in food stalls along the street where they barbecue them, and you can get quite a good price for them. They're also herbivores. They sometimes eat some tiny crustaceans or things like that, but overall they prefer a plant-based diet consisting of seaweeds, but they can also eat farm waste products like rice bran or leafy vegetables that are over the expiry date. And they're very docile and friendly fish, which makes them very suitable for polyculture. So in the Philippines, people already farm them together with milkfish and shrimp. The advantage when you do polyculture is that you hedge your risks because you're culturing multiple species at the same time. If the price of one is low, maybe the price of the other fish you are selling is still good. Plus, often if you combine the right species together, you improve the circularity, as one species might feed off the waste of the other species. As my colleague Greg Jan, a sustainable aquaculture expert from the Philippines, noted, the culture of lower trophic marine herbivores has enormous potential to feed the world's growing population, while simultaneously reducing the environmental footprint of the food we produce. Again, at the end of the presentation are a few articles, including one of rabbitfish, and Kyra will also talk a bit more about them. One that maybe people not think about that quickly, but that I personally find super interesting, are aquarium fish, because we all like fish. But the fish we produce and we sell are, eaten. But you can also sell them to people who put them in a nice big aquarium and enjoy them for many years. And often they are willing to pay a premium. So actually the worldwide aquarium trade, including freshwater fish, is about $10 billion. But just the marine segment is worth about $5 billion annually. And almost all the marine aquarium fish that are being sold currently are wild caught. So people catch them from coral reefs, often using destructive fishing methods like cyanide fishing. But there is a lot of potential to breed and farm them. So some people started doing this now. There is a good demand for it because the aquarium folks, the hobbyists, also prefer to have a sustainably produced fish. They also live longer in your aquarium because they are used to captivity and they're healthy. I believe it has a lot of potential also for smaller producers. The fish on the photo is an example of a fish produced by a friend of mine, and these are really rare, special angelfish he produces. And just to give you an idea, the rarest of them he sells for around $10,000 to $15,000 each for a single fish. So it's something that people don't think about, but also for Africa, for example, breeding more aquarium fish. Because in Asia, the freshwater species are already mostly bred in countries like Thailand, Vietnam, Taiwan. But in Africa, there are very few producers of freshwater aquarium fish, while the continent got an enormous diversity of freshwater fish, right? So it's definitely something that is interesting. And to make a living, since they fetch better prices in general, you can produce fewer fish and still make a living. Mm-hmm. One problem is that many of these species are not yet domesticated, and that brings me to the next slide. So when you're interested for your own fish farm or for a project to start developing native species for aquaculture, here are a few thoughts, a few ideas that we have from our side after doing this for the last 20 years. So one is select a species with solid local demand. So look which fish are interesting from a local culinary perspective, from local traditions. Don't pick a species that cannot be sold locally. And because it skips you a lot of hassle of exporting the fish and looking for an overseas market. Then don't make it too difficult and select the species for which the larval or the fingerling rearing process is mostly known. So it doesn't need to be per se 100% known for this exact species, but maybe people are producing already a cousin or a brother or a sister species, something related, so that you can copy that and use that as a starting point. Do not pick a species that nobody has a clue about farming. I made that example. I started the spiny lobster hatchery and in short lost all my money because it's extremely difficult and almost, well, one or two farms are now starting to do it, but it's nearly impossible. 3 is often species that grow eventually to a bigger size have better growth rates in farming, because in half a year or a year you want to create a decent sized fish that you can sell for people to eat. So if you select a fish species that takes 4 years to reach 20 centimeters, that wouldn't be really a good idea, right? So try to select species that generally grow bigger, like half a meter or a meter, because they are likely to attain a reasonable size within a year. Then you saw me in the last few slides quite enthusiastic about herbivorous fish and other lower trophic species, because the problem is aquaculture, especially those dominant species like salmon, sea bass that I mentioned earlier, they're all top predators. So they need to eat, in most cases, meat, other fish to grow well, We also don't do this on the land. On the land we farm cows or goats, which both eat grass or leaves. We're not farming tigers to eat, right? So if we continue to focus our attention only on carnivores, the agriculture sector really will have an increasingly large footprint and an increasingly large negative impact on the natural environment. So I try to think about herbivorous species and lower trophic species. The advantage for you is that they can also be farmed at a lower cost. So it costs you less to start because plant-based feeds are cheaper. Last, as I said already earlier, try to look at friendly fish, fish that are not too aggressive, that can be farmed in a polyculture setting, because that improves the circularity of your farming activity, and you can further reduce production risks. To give you an idea, for example, let's say you're farming shrimp, but shrimp, when they eat the pellets, they're often very messy eaters, just like tilapias, and they leave a lot of mess in the fish pond. So if you add sea cucumbers or if you add mullets, they will clean up that mess. So you don't actually need to buy that much extra feed. It is just that this second species you add to your pond will clean up the mess created by the first species. So with the same amount of expenses, you produce more fish to sell. One small note here is, after you have done this and you have selected your species, of course, you want to improve them further. You want to attain better growth rates and, for example, create fish that are more disease resistant. But do remember that once you improve your native fish species, it will also start to differ genetically from the native fish species in the wild. So although your fish species is native, its genes do not longer represent the wild population. And if they escape, could and are likely to also outcompete the local native gene pool. This, for example, has happened with salmon in Europe. In Norway, the Atlantic salmon is native. But when they escaped, these fish, because they were improved and had much better growth rates, they started outcompeting the local gene pool of these native fish. And DNA research has shown that some rivers now only contain the domesticated strain and no longer the wild strain of salmon. So I would like to thank you all for listening. Questions can be asked at the end after Kyra's presentation. Here are a few of the articles that we wrote and published early about this topic. You can read more about it if you're interested. And thank you for your time and looking forward to the questions later on.
Thank you very much, Jonah, and for the practical insights as well at the end of how to choose your native species well. I'll hand straight over to Kyra then for the next part.
Thank you, Annemarie. Thank you, Jonah. Yeah, so I will talk to you a little bit about the project that we did in the Philippines on sustainable mariculture as an alternative livelihood for fishermen on the island of Palawan. So this, just to be clear, this is not an ongoing project. This was the first project that Jonah and myself did on aquaculture. It was back in between 2008 and 2016. But it's still it is still my favorite project that I've ever done on aquaculture. It was quite unique because we did it as a non-profit with the goal to provide livelihood to the coastal communities and protect the wild grouper species. So next slide, please. So yeah, as I said, this project, we did it in the Philippines on the island of Palawan, in the main city of Puerto Princesa. So Palawan is a very important biodiversity hotspot and also a very important ecological corridor in Southeast Asia. But as many of the islands in the Pacific, there's a lot of pressure on its coastal and marine ecosystems, and it's increasing very fast, this pressure. So sustainable use of the coastal natural resources is very important for the future generations. And that's why we decided to start a project like this. We both did our internship in the Philippines, and then when we finished our studies, we moved there to start this project. Actually, Jonah didn't even finish his studies. He took a break to start this project on his studies and finished later. And why we chose Puerto Princesa is because the local mayor there, he was really focused on preserving and promoting the environment. So he invited us basically to start our project there. Next slide, please. So it's very important project to do for us because a lot of the population in these coastal areas are dependent on the marine resources as a sort of income and also as a source of protein. And but because of the increase in number of fishermen, the strong demand for fish, it led to unsustainable practices. Like, for example, dynamite fishing. So they blow up everything, the whole coral reef, and collect all the fish. And also, Jonah mentioned already that they use cyanide, which is basically poisoning all the organisms that live in the corals. The bigger fish, they might recover and be still alive, but everything else that is left behind is then killed. And they also use this to catch smaller and smaller fish, because at one point all the big fish are gone, so they just started to catch smaller and smaller fish. And then they put these smaller fish in fish cages to grow them out and sell them at market price. And we chose grouper because grouper aquaculture was still a challenge, but it was already proven, the full cycle was already proven to be done in other countries like Indonesia. So we saw it as a challenge, but we knew it was a possibility. Next slide, please. So the goal of this project was to reduce the use of wild grouper fingerlings. As I said, they were catching smaller and smaller fish from the wild and then putting them in cages. So we wanted to provide an alternative to this. And then we also want to increase the capacity building for aquaculture in the area, improve livelihoods of small-scale farmers, and ensure food security for the communities. So we did this basically by setting up a marine finfish hatchery where we produced 4 species of grouper. Grouper are all they are all native to Palawan, and we sold the fingerlings at 3 inch for cost price, or the same price or lower than they would buy the wild fingerlings for. And we sold it all over the island of Palawan and also to other islands in the Philippines. And then we also provided training and pellet feeds to the growers that used our fingerlings to support them. So yeah, sorry. Well, 1 second more on the other one. Yeah, I will go through the species. So we grew tiger grouper, which is also called brown marbled grouper, green grouper, and Malabar grouper. Green grouper and Malabar grouper are more mangrove species, while tiger and mouse grouper are more coral reef species. And then, as Jonah said, we also tried at the end of our project, we also tried to develop the protocol for rabbitfish. So that was also added to the list of species. These are all local species, all native. We used a simple flow-through system, and it was built with local materials. We also hired local staff, so graduates from the local universities and people from the village. These were most ex-prisoners and their families, because we were located next to a very large open prison. So when they got out and they had nowhere to go, they would settle in this small village where we were located. And they didn't have a job. So when we provided them work, they were very happy and very hardworking. So it was a win-win in the end. So yeah, we had like a 120-ton hatchery, which is on the top right. And then below that is the nursery, which was 10 tanks of 2 tons. Then we had 3 very large broodstock tanks, which you can see on the top left. And then we had floating cages in the bay. So these cages also helped broodstock. And then we had an algae laboratory where we cultured up to 5 different species of algae, which then were upscaled in very simple tarpaulin tanks, which you can see in the middle low photo. And then these algae were used for greening the tanks and for feeding the rotifer, which are small zooplanktons that the smallest larvae eat. And then we also used Artemia to feed the larger larvae. In total, the capacity of this hatchery was around 10,000 fingerlings per month. Next slide, please. So in the end, we had a steady monthly production of grouper fingerlings. We reached the break-even point after approximately 5 years, and we provided in that year we provided fingerlings to all the cage farmers on Palawan. So everyone who had cages, they were buying fingerlings from our hatchery instead of from fishermen, so from the wild. And the final production that we reached was 90,000 fingerlings per year. And here you can see some photos of the fingerlings of the different species. So the groupers, they were also very happy with our fingerlings, because the hatchery grown fingerlings, they are already used to eating pellets. They grow fast and they grow uniform, as they're all the same size. They are strong, they're disease-free, while wild fingerlings, they are not used to eating pellets, and they are often all different sizes, so they don't grow at the same rate altogether. The average survival rate of the farmers was around 76%, which is still on the low side, but it was the first batch, and they still had things to learn. Sometimes they made mistakes, sometimes they were not in the right location, for example, and they had some problem due to climate or environmental factors. For example, a typhoon would come over the farm and they lost everything. So some of the farms, they reached up to 89% survival, which is very good. They market the fish between $7 and $9 per kilo, so it's quite a high value fish. They all sell to local buyers in Palawan, and they sell them when they are between 450 and 800 grams. We worked with 23 farmers, and the farmers, they were actually aware that what they were doing, buying the fingerlings from hatchery instead of the wild, contributes to the conservation of the species, because they also noticed that the number of grouper in the sea went down very rapidly in the last years. And then, yeah, we provided a training program to them. So we provided training to them on how to feed them, on basically all the basics of farming fish. Of course, we also had a lot of challenges during this period. So, for example, grouper is one of the most difficult marine species to culture. So we did a lot of trial and error, and it took a lot of patience to develop the protocols, because also even in other places it's done. Every place, every facility is different. So you need to keep adjusting to all the circumstances are quite right for this really sensitive species. Also, to obtain the eggs from the breeders was a challenge. So we used different groups of broodstock of different species. We also did a specific feeding protocol for them. So we fed them very high quality feeds, such as squid, to promote the development of eggs and sperm. And then some species like the green grouper, we also induced with hormones to obtain spawning behavior. And then cannibalism is very big in the nursery phase, especially with the tiger grouper. So they like to eat their brothers and sisters. And things we did to reduce that is like frequent sorting, adjusting the stocking density, regular feeding, improve water circulation, and also using very high quality feeds. Then we had a lot of problems with power supply. So in the area where we were was quite remote, quite a distance from the city. So there were a lot of blackouts. And for that, we had a backup generator. But this also failed sometimes. So we were called in the middle of the night when the generator broke. We had to go there with a technician to fix it, because without power, there was no aeration in the tanks. And without aeration, these small fish die within hours. So this was quite stressful. But the biggest challenge was navigating the bureaucracy, the corruption, and the local politics. So, for example, they had the same regulation for wild and farmed fish. They didn't have distinguished that. So we had to test our fingerlings who've never even seen the sea for cyanide. And also, we always had to pay like an undocumented payment when we wanted to import feeds from abroad. And then finally, also, we had to hand over the whole project to the government because of political issues. And now I went back last year or 1.5 years ago to the Philippines, and now they're building a luxury hotel on the place where this hatchery was. So unfortunately, the farmers cannot buy any more fingerlings to grow. So I guess they're back to wild caught fingerlings, unfortunately. And then I wanted to, next slide please, then I wanted to highlight the rabbitfish, as Jonah promised. So at the end of our time there, we did an experiment with rabbit fish. So we developed a protocol to grow fingerlings of rabbit fish. And as Jonah said, these are herbivorous fish. So as opposed to grouper are very carnivorous fish. So they also need a lot of fish meal. So to also be able to grow a more like fish with a lower footprint, we decided to develop this protocol. And then because it also has a very high demand locally, and it's currently mostly from fisheries. So they tolerate a lot of environmental changes, and they are non-aggressive. So they don't have this cannibalistic behavior as the grouper have. So it's much easier to culture them than, for example, grouper. Yeah, so we published our results of this trial, which you can see here in the link on this slide. And also we published with the FAO an article on farming rabbit fish in Asia. If you're interested, you can also read more about that. So yeah, that was our little project. I hope you found it interesting, and thank you very much for your attention. And I guess now we have some time for discussion and questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kyra, for sharing specifically on your case study there. Oh, there's one more slide.
Yeah, it's just about the organization.
Okay, yeah. So if people want to look that up
yeah,
further,
you can also find more information on our website, finsandleaves.org.
Yeah, and the other countries that you're operating in as well, right?
Yeah, exactly. About all the projects that we do.
Yes. Well, thank you. I had a few questions, but I won't ask all of them so that others get a chance as well. But maybe firstly for Jonah, you mentioned how that in many developing countries, there's still that strong perception that non-native species are actually more commercially attractive. And why do you think that perception persists? Especially if you were speaking about native species actually can fetch higher prices. So why do you think that perception persists, and how difficult has it been to kind of build confidence around that practically, that native species are a viable option?
Good question, Annemarie. I think partly it's cultural in the sense that I still see in the global south and in Asia and in Africa that sometimes people look up to Europe and or America, and they think that maybe things there are much better, or at least the fish farmed there are better and more interesting. Like salmon, if you watch a movie or you see advertisements, it's a fish that often passes by, not the local fish that you find in your local river. That one rarely makes the news lines. So that is one. Two, it's also partly the feed mill's responsibility, in my opinion. Because the feed mills that are active in Africa and Asia, they don't got tailored feeds for all the species, but for a handful of species, like tilapia or pangasius. So they encourage farmers to farm those species and not new species for which they don't have feed.
Productive cycle.
Then the last part of the answer is the grass is always greener at the neighbors. We did make the same mistake before, because in the beginning, when we started producing the native groupers, we thought we were going to export them all for our farmers, because overseas we would get better prices in China. So I went to China, to Hong Kong. We did shipments to Hong Kong. It's a lot of hassle because it's a long distance with airplanes. You need permits. There's a lot of corruption, a lot of competition. And then I went just to the local capital, Manila, and I walked around the restaurants there and talked with the owners, and it turned out that they always had a shortage of groupers, and they were giving us a price that was maybe lower than the price in Hong Kong, but the profit for the farmers was bigger. because they had less costs. They didn't have to export the fish. There would be no mortality during the transport. You didn't have to pay these fees for the corruption. So all in all, it was less stress, and they could just sell the fish locally and make more profit. So I think hopefully that answers your question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does. Thank you. Alex, you raised your hand. Welcome if you want to ask a question as well, or from the chat.
Yeah, cheers. Thanks, guys. Interesting stuff. Kyra, you mentioned, of course, like that the sad end to that cool project up in the Philippines, and then also you, like, your next slide was that you work across different countries and with different projects. What do you think? Well, maybe you can go either way with this question, but do you think there's been some interesting things that you've learnt in one country which has been applicable in another context, or is it all very, like, do you start from scratch each time? And then alternatively, you can go either way with this one. Do you think that there's like what are some of the keys to making a project sustainable in a context which isn't your own? Which one? Like, you can choose either direction.
Yeah. So first of all, we learned a lot about this project. It was our first project, so we were just from university, right?
Yeah.
So we learned
Totally
tons, like about all different aspects of business, aquaculture, all around the block. So, and this has been very valuable for all the projects that I've done afterwards. But I must say that these projects that I did afterwards were I was not the farmer. In the Philippines, we were the farmers, right? So that's a total different perspective of doing a project. With the other projects, we were more consulting, so providing advice, which I think because we were farmers ourselves, we can give farmers better advice, of course. But a lot of lessons learned would apply across the board. After this project, we have done a lot of work on implementing best practices with small-scale farmers. So this best practice includes making it more sustainable, like socially, financially, environmentally, food security-wise. So it covers all the aspects, which we adjust for the different types of aquaculture, like high value, low value species, small scale farmers, larger farms. There is a little bit of difference, but in general, these principles apply to most farms. So that, if that answers your question.
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you. Brandon, you've got your hand raised if you want to ask your question.
Hi, thanks. This question is more just directed around the polyculture aspect, particularly where you've got more than one fish species type. Just any experience or insights or particular thoughts around the variability in susceptibility to disease, particularly infectious disease. So one of the things that we can see is that you can have one fish type that will develop like a carrier status or a very low level of disease expression from certain infectious agents, and another fish, exactly the same infectious organism, will demonstrate a much worse presentation of the disease and high morbidity and mortality. So just from a polyculture point of view, whether you had any experience of that, or there were specific, should we say, partnerings of fish species or groups that you've realized mitigates that risk?
Yeah, excellent question. Although we went to university and maybe have a science degree, we're not really scientists. Our specialty is mostly to try to make it work in the practical world. How we do not always understand the how, but we focus the why, but we focus on how to make it work. But to give you an example, so we did some work with the rabbit fish, which is related to Annemarie's next question. Putting rabbit fish actually in the grouper cages, so because they occupy the same habitat, the coastal zone, but they have very different niches, which is positive. And because they're not very closely related, not at all, it's rather unlikely that they infect each other with diseases. Or let me say differently, let's say there is a disease outbreak A, which affects your groupers. It is highly likely that you can still harvest your rabbit fish. But it requires a lot of experimenting to see what works and what doesn't. And typically, there's not so much money available to try these things because from a commercial perspective, it's less interesting. Monocultures are mostly pushed. So it's just trial and error in the field. And what was the interesting with the groupers is, so the groupers live in cages, and the algae and barnacles grow on these cages, and the groupers like to sit on them. But when the water moves, the current, the groupers are being scratched by the net, by the barnacles on there, and then they can get skin infections. But the rabbit fish, they're grazers, and they actually keep the nets clean. So they're having a diet of live organisms, live seaweeds growing on the nets. And the groupers were also happier because they get scratched less. So in the end, you try to do something like that. Similarly, we're currently working in Kenya, where you can culture native tilapias and native catfish together. And as I said, just like some other fish, tilapias are also very messy eaters. They often put a pellet in their mouth, chew on it, and spit it out again, and do that a few times, and you lose a lot of particles, feed particles. But the advantage when you add the pangas, the catfish, the African catfish, they will feed that from the bottom. Plus, if the tilapia spawn unwantedly in the pond, the catfish can eat them as well. But the disadvantage is you really need to select fish that are in the right size bracket. So you first want to put your tilapia when they are big enough that they cannot be eaten anymore by the catfish that you're going to put, then you can put them. So for each species mix, there are really considerations, and a lot still needs to be learned on that.
Great, thanks very much. I particularly like your mitigation risk point of the catfish and the tilapia. Make certain your tilapia
Thank you, Brandon. Alex, another question from you.
Yeah, just a quick one before we run out of time. I'm probably the newest to aquaculture in the room. Maybe Annemarie might have me covered on that one. But when we're all here promoting native species, and a lot of the contexts we might work in, well, certainly that in Lake Tanganyika, we're quite lucky to have a relatively, let's say, blank canvas. There isn't a large aquaculture industry already. Do either of you guys know a situation where a native species has replaced an invasive species in a commercial aquaculture setting, where there may already be an invasive species sort of, industry set up for some number of years, and a switch has happened where people have moved en masse to a native species? Either of you know an example where that has worked out?
Excellent question, Alex. I think the good example is the farming of white leg shrimp. So in the 70s, 80s, Southeast Asia, thanks to CEFDEC, I believe we have Madame Eguia from CEFDEC here. CEFDEC invented the culture of, or closed the cycle for farming tiger prawns, which were native to Southeast Asia. But they grew a bit slower, and there were a few issues, and in the end, people opted to farm white leg shrimp, which I believe are from South America, instead. And in the end, in the 2000 till 2010, white leg shrimp really dominated in Southeast Asia. But a lot of diseases came up in Thailand, Vietnam, and the industry literally lost billions because this species was less adapted to local pathogens. And currently quite a few farmers are switching back to tiger prawn, saying, yeah, maybe they grow a little bit slower, but they seem to be better fitted to the local environment, better adapted to local pathogens, and actually they fetch a better price than the white leg shrimp. So although they first lost the race, now they're coming back and they're in a way taking over the niche that was taken by the white leg shrimp. Maybe that's a good example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Jonah. And I think just one closing question now is obviously one of the goals of the Alliance is to see what it takes to scale native species aquaculture across the global south. So if we look ahead, let's say 10 or 15 years, what would you say needs to change to make native species aquaculture really scalable from being relatively niche to more mainstream?
Yeah, a very important question for the global south. I think one is our policymakers and the people with the money in the end need to understand what we have discussed today together, the potential of native species, the disadvantages of using non-native species. If we want to create resilient, future-proof food production systems, we really need to bet big on native species. And I think once our policymakers understand that and put money towards farming these native species, like putting hatcheries that focus on these species, pushing feed millers to develop feeds for native species, discourage farmers in general to only go for carnivorous fish species, but also try to promote lower trophic herbivorous fish and other lower trophic animals, we will get very far. And by collaborating through initiatives like yours, I think that's a great first step.
Thank you. Yeah, well, let's end on that optimistic note. And Maria, maybe you can, if you go and ask a question.
I actually have a comment. Thank you, Jonah. For actually, I didn't want to talk, but I do feel your frustrations insofar as promoting native species for aquaculture. I think there are many factors that need to be considered. First and foremost, the government has its own priority species. You know me as having promoted tilapias, but the government has already done some initiatives to control areas where it should not be found. So they have the Basil program. I don't know how successful that program is. But then again, at one point, there's another initiative from the government to introduce an invasive one, which I don't actually agree with. I don't know if you've heard of crayfish being introduced. So yes, so it's so frustrating. Me having worked in aquaculture for the longest time, I feel that I don't think it's a wise thing to do. And then like I worked for some time for about 4 decades at CFDEC. We've had work done on native species like we call it ayungin. It's a freshwater fish. Breeding has been established, but still no takers. So that's the sad part. And I guess like the commercial growers would rather invest on species that they know would give them easy profit, reproductive cycle not too long, system of breeding is not too difficult, larval rearing is also not difficult. So I guess those are some of the factors that really affect promotion of the native species. So that's just my take on the idea about native species being promoted for aquaculture. I'm all for it though. Thank you.
Yeah, no, but I think you're very right. And it's also a difficult balance. I fully understand why the Philippines first did focus on tilapia, because you need to feed your population. So it's also a food security issue, right? You cannot only choose for the environment. But at the same time, the Philippines, in a way, they're a leading example in Southeast Asia. Take milkfish. It's the mostly cultured marine fin fish in the Philippines. While it's also popular in Africa, but nobody is farming it yet there. They're only taking it from the wild. So I think institutions like yours have already played a very big role in promoting the culture of native species, and I'm sure you will continue to do so. No.
Hopefully. I've moved to the academy because I've retired. Retirement is quite early,
Okay.
60.
No
But
problem.
I still continue and I hope to contribute more. Thank you. Thank you for
Thank
giving
you.
me the time to speak.
Thank you, Maria. Great. Well, thank you, everyone. If you have any more questions or suggestions or would want to collaborate further with us, then please just drop me a mail. We'd be glad to hear from you. If you want to speak at a next webinar, we are open to hear from you. Thank you again to Jonah and Kyra for sharing from your work today. And yeah, I wish you all a good rest of the day.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you
Thanks,
too,
everyone.
Annemarie. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Cheers. See you later.